This video is for AP Environmental Science, Chapter 3, Ecosystems. So this chapter is looking at structure of ecosystems as well as some of the main concepts that we need to be aware of. So for the first page, the core case study, make sure that you read through it because some of the important things that it talks about is it goes over why tropical rainforests are so important. So make sure you understand what are some of the ecosystem services that they provide. Of course, it also talks about what are some of the different human activities or the things that we're doing to cause potential harm to rainforests and why they're in danger of disappearing. And of course, why should we care? So again, going back to connecting to the idea of sustainability and ecosystem services. So for the first section in Chapter 1, this is just kind of looking at the main things. Why can life exist on the planet? Okay, and so you need to be aware that there are basically 4 different spheres or parts of the planet that are working together. We've got the atmosphere, and so we're going to go back into more detail when we talk about air pollution and look at the composition of the atmosphere. But for right now, just know that the troposphere is the layer of the atmosphere that's closest to the Earth's surface. That's where all the weather happens. So it rains and we have tornadoes, hurricanes, snow, that's all troposphere. The stratosphere is the level above the troposphere, so it's the next one. That is where the ozone layer is. That's where we have the ozone that's kind of intercepting the UV radiation that's coming from the solar system, or from space, and from the sun, and it's intercepting that. And without that ozone layer, that's where we would start to see UV radiation interfering with DNA and other genetic material in a lot of cells and potentially causing mutations. So the next level is the hydrosphere, which is all of the liquid and solid water on the Earth. Then we've got the geosphere, which is all the rock and different geological layers. And then last is the biosphere, which is all of the life, all of the living organisms on the planet. It talks about in this chapter kind of what are the 3 main reasons why life exists on the planet. So, of course, we've got the idea or the concept of solar radiation coming in, and it's a one-way flow of energy. It's a one-way flow of high-quality energy. So that's coming from the sun. That energy is being harnessed by photosynthetic organisms, and it's being changed and converted into compounds that those organisms and other organisms can access or use. And then it also kind of connects to the greenhouse effect, which I'm going to wait until the next page to talk about. And then there's the cycling of nutrients, which of course water cycle, carbon cycle, hydrogen cycle, phosphorus, sulfur cycle, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. But of course those nutrients, as they cycle back and forth, those are also a main reason or an important reason why life can exist on the planet. And then the last one is gravity. The fact that you've got gravity that's holding these gases as well as other things, but the gases that are making up the atmosphere, that's what keeps those gases from floating away, is the gravitational pull on them. So going back to the greenhouse effect, we need to remember that the greenhouse effect is a normal, naturally occurring phenomenon. And so think of it as like using a blanket to keep warm. Okay, so how it works is you've got solar radiation coming from the sun. It bounces off of, or some of it bounces off of the surface of the Earth. Some of it is trapped and absorbed by the Earth's surface, by organisms on the Earth's surface. Okay, and so what happens is that solar radiation that could potentially bounce back off into space, some of it instead hits those gases that are in the atmosphere, and instead of going into space, they bounce back towards the planet so that it traps that heat. And so it's like, the reason why I say it's like using a blanket is because that's how a blanket works. Some of your body heat can escape from that blanket, but depending on the thickness of the blanket, it's going to retain some of that body heat, which is what keeps you warm. So of course, the thicker the blanket, the warmer you stay, because the thicker the blanket, the more body heat is being trapped. So when we talk later on in the year about global climate change, we'll go back and we'll look at why is that atmospheric, or why are these atmospheric layers thickening? Why is it trapping more heat? And then what are the results? Okay. All right. So section 2 is looking now at the components of an ecosystem. So remember that when we talk about ecosystems, we're looking at, or an ecologist is going to look at certain levels of organization. So certain kind of trophic levels. So we're starting off the level of an organism. And then, of course, remember, population are all of the organisms of the same species living in the same area. Then we've got the community, which are all of the different populations living in that area. So we're still talking about just living things, all of the biotic factors. And then we've got the ecosystem, which is looking at the different communities of living things, but also now incorporating the abiotic or the non-living things in that particular ecosystem. And then, of course, the biosphere is all living things or everything on the planet. Okay. Make sure you understand the levels of organization. Remember, what is the difference between producer and consumer? Producers are also known as autotrophs or self-feeders. They're the ones who feed themselves by basically going through photosynthesis or a process like chemosynthesis, where they're producing their own compounds that they can then later on go break down for cellular respiration. And so, all that stuff that you learned about in bio, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and how those things interact together, that's coming back into play now. A side note, which is not in your textbook, but it's something that I'm adding, or we need to add in, because it's going to be something that you need to know for the AP exam, is remember that visible light exists in different wavelengths. So there's red light, and there's orange and yellow and green and blue and violet. And if you remember from bio, there are different spectrums of light that plants or photosynthetic organisms absorb really well, and there are other spectrums that don't absorb really well. And so when we talk about aquatic photosynthetic organisms, you've got to remember that sunlight can only penetrate so far, so deep into the ocean. So red light is absorbed really well by plants, by photosynthetic organisms, but red light can only really get absorbed in roughly about the first meter of water. So that's remember, 1 meter is roughly about 3 feet. So that's why that's why most of the algae tends to be up towards the top. There are other organisms that have evolved methods to, they go through photosynthesis, but they've evolved ways to kind of address the lack of different wavelengths of light. Blue light is able to penetrate a lot deeper, so roughly up to about 100 meters deeper in clear water. And so you've got these organisms that are able to harness and effectively mostly just use blue light instead to produce or go through photosynthesis. So just remember and kind of go back over the different wavelengths of light and try to go back and review from bio which wavelengths of light are used for photosynthesis and which wavelengths of light are reflected instead or not used. Okay. All right. So continuing on, remember that consumers or heterotrophs, those are organisms that cannot produce their own food by going through a process like photosynthesis. So humans are heterotrophs or consumers. Herbivores or deer, for example, are also consumers or heterotrophs. So we have to get our energy by eating other things. So when we start talking about all of these are referred to as trophic levels. Okay, and so you're a producer, or you're a primary consumer or first level consumer, or you're a secondary consumer or tertiary consumer. And so that goes into the food webs, which will go on to the next page. But also don't forget, when you talk about consumers, make sure that you go back and you review and you remember what is the difference between carnivores, omnivores, herbivores, as well as when you specifically start talking about some of the carnivores, also detritivores, things like that. So just make sure that you go back over those and what are the differences, how do they obtain their energy. All right. Decomposers, really important, because remember there's a difference between decomposers and detritivores or detritus feeders. So decomposers are organisms that while they're in the process of getting their own nutrients, they're releasing nutrients from waste or from organic remains and returning those nutrients back into the soil and water and air. So those decomposers are really important because they're a big, huge part of biogeochemical cycles. There's other consumers, which are the detritus feeders. They're feeding on the debris, on the things that are left over. and they're kind of breaking it down, but they're not necessarily releasing things back into the biogeochemical cycles. They're just pretty much breaking down and eating dead material. All right. Now, remember, also don't forget, know the difference between abiotic and biotic. So remember, A means without, so bio means life. So abiotic is non-living, so without life. Biotic are the living components. So for example, in this picture, you should be able to identify all of the different things. What are the biotic components or the living parts, and what are the abiotic or non-living parts? All right. Respiration is the same thing as cellular respiration. So again, this should be reviewed from bio, but taking the glucose or the compounds that we are consuming along with oxygen, because it needs to be that final electron acceptor. It needs to be that final electron acceptor in the process. They go through that process that breaks down the glucose. Carbon dioxide is released as a waste product. Some water is produced, and then energy is produced, and most of that energy gets transformed into ATP. All right. We don't have a lot of time to talk about bacteria. We'll talk about them a little bit when we talk about the nitrogen cycle in another part of the chapter. Make sure you go over this section because it talks about the important roles of bacteria and other microorganisms. So this is a very, very important section, so make sure you take some time with this.